Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us so early this morning to listen to the brilliant research and work of Shanika and Naledi. My name is Sofia Holing. I'm going to be chairing our panel today, and I'm very, very happy that this panel is here and advancing the research and the discussion around the issues of state violence and incarceration here at the Law Transform Center. Our panel is called Carceral Harm and Gender, Perspectives from South Africa and the United States, bringing together critical perspectives, addressing the role of law and legal tools and institutional and policy tools in advancing rights and countering those harms, also looking critically at the limitations of these tools, thinking of alternatives for going forward. We will first be hearing from Shanika Freeman, who is a recent graduate from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She does research on prison reentry and recidivism amongst women. She is here in Norway as a Fulbright grantee. Today she will be presenting the research that she has done and already finalized about formerly incarcerated women and reentry in Baltimore. But here in Norway, she's doing research about formerly incarcerated women here in Norway, both looking at Norwegian women, women who are originally from here, and women with migrant backgrounds. So a super interesting and complex research that hopefully we will be hearing about soon in a new presentation once she is done with her with her fieldwork and research. But today she'll be telling us about perspectives from the United States. And then after, I'll introduce Naledi, but let's hear from Shanika first. The floor is yours, Shanika.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can all of you guys hear me? Okay. All right. So, thank you guys so much for coming here so early. And thank you, Sophia, for introducing me. Again, my name is Shanika Freeman, and I recently graduated from university in the U.S. And during my time at the university, I was able to do a qualitative study on women in reentry, more specifically exploring social networks and family dynamics in reentry in women in Baltimore City. It was a very eye-opening research, a very eye-opening experience, and I learned a lot, and hopefully you all can sort of take something from it as well. Before I really dig into it, I do want to draw your attention to a quote here. I wasn't born to be caged and chained up, and this is by a quote by Susan Burton. She was incarcerated for about 20 years, in and out of prison for 20 years, and every single time she went out, she found it very difficult to get the help and support she needed as a Black woman. So when she finally got out, it took a few years, but she founded a new way of life, which is a support organization for formerly incarcerated women in California. So this quote really resonated with me, and hopefully you all can sort of take that in, and hopefully it resonates with you as well. Again, I am from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Baltimore, Maryland. It's not that far from Washington, D.C. In a few slides, I'm going to show you all some pictures, and I do want to just be mindful that Baltimore is such a beautiful city. It's full of life and joy. So even despite the pictures I am going to show you, there's still so much joy in Baltimore City. So I just want to make sure you all be mindful of that. So this is a picture of a neighborhood in West Baltimore. A lot of the women I talk to are from West Baltimore and East Baltimore as well. As you can see, the houses are boarded up. They're literally falling apart. And you would think that there's no life here, right? But if you can see the cream-colored or white-colored house with a little satellite dish, there's a family living there. And there's a few families living in this neighborhood as well as west side of Baltimore. If you look outside right now, you can probably see the view of like a mountain or like the ocean and the sea and, just life, right? So just imagine waking up every single day and seeing that falling apart house, or seeing just a lot of strife and abandoned houses and abandoned lots. So you can just imagine how it would affect your day to day. This is a neighborhood in East Baltimore. This is where I'm from. It's about a block away from where I grew up. And when I leave Norway and go back to the States, I'm going to more than likely be on the east side of Baltimore and see a lot of these things. And again, as you can see, a lot of vacant housing, just altogether not a place that you would normally choose to live if given a choice. And a lot of the women that I interview come from places like these. Again, it's not all of Baltimore, and again, it's still a lot of joy in these neighborhoods, but I just want to highlight the reality of the situations that a lot of these women face. So in the United States, about 1.9 million women are released from prisons and jails every single year, state prisons and jails every year. And in Maryland, it's about 15,000 women every single year. So just imagine you're one of 15,000 women being released from prison, and you're given $50 in gate money. So $50 is about, what, 500 kroner? So just imagine you're giving that. And gate money, it's basically a one-time cash sum that you're giving, and that's supposed to take care of your transportation back to the city, back to a family, if you have family, or shelter. And be mindful that a lot of state prisons are in the county, so it's about 2 hours to 2.5 hours away from the city, and that's on public transportation. And again, you're supposed to make sure you get your basic necessities, right? Any housing, shelter, food, things like that. And if you are able to go into the city, sometimes the shelters, homeless shelters, are full, so they don't have space. Or sometimes you might get to them, let's say 7 p.m. and they close at 5 p.m. Right? So they'll turn you away. So you probably want to likely have to find a place on the streets, and that's a reality of a lot of women that I talk to. If you are one of the lucky ones to have a reentry program or support from a reintegration program, most of those programs are male-centered, and they do not take into consideration the trauma that comes with being surrounded by male-centered spaces for these women. There is a reentry program in Maryland called Pivot. It is the only reentry program in Maryland that's specifically for women. And Pivot is a 9-week program, and they help you with housing, financial literacy, education, and also they help you try to reunite with your children. But again, you're one of 15,000 women that's being released from state prisons and jails in Maryland, and it's only one reentry program, and they can't take them all. So this just really highlights the how important it is to have gender care and just catering to the needs of women specifically. One of the women that I spoke to at Pivot said this quote. I'm going to read it to you all. I have 2 children that are in the foster care system. I don't have my 2 boys, and it gets rough. It's a feeling I wouldn't want any mother to have. And I'm not sure if any of you all are parents, but just sort of imagine how that would be. I mean, some of these women are not, they're not hugging their kids. They haven't hugged their kids for 5, 10, 15 years. So just imagine how traumatizing that can be. And a lot of times when they do get out, they are not reunited with their children. So it's a really uphill battle for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because I truly believe like the experts in this field, it's not me, it's the women that I've talked to. So I do want to kind of center them, but just to talk about the data and the numbers here. You can see in the sort of pink colored, about 50% of women that I talked to that participated in reentry programs and reintegration programs, whether that be Pivot or any other reentry programs that are usually a little male-centered, they found support with reconnecting with their family, reconnecting with their children, and just the community at large. However, 52% of non-participants found it extremely difficult, and a lot of them felt rejected by the community that they actually grew up in. It's a lot of stigma when it comes to women. It's stigma in general when it comes to formerly incarcerated individuals, but definitely women and mothers as well. So I, again, just wanted to sort of highlight the numbers for that. And this is a quote right here that really resonated with me. This person has been incarcerated for nearly 10 years, and I will read it to you. When I first got out, it was hard. It was like I was happy to be out, freedom. But at the same time, I felt a certain type of way because the friends I had inside were my family for nearly 10 years. How are you supposed to leave that all behind? And in the United States, we often look at reentry outward. So we sort of want to sweep the past under the rug and move forward, but we don't really look at the trauma it comes with taking somebody out of a family. Like they've spent 10, 15, 20 years with these people in prison forming bonds for survival, but just forming bonds. And it's really traumatic and really hard to sort of be taken away from that, much like they were taken away from their family while being incarcerated. So it's not really talked about, and a lot of the women that I've talked to said that they felt guilty. They felt like sort of survivor's remorse, even just being taken away from that family. So I feel like in the United States, we really do need to sort of look into that and really just make sure that we address that, which is why as well I'm here in Norway trying to figure out, how do we address it? How do you all address it in Norway? Maybe I can take a lot of the points and things that I've learned here back into the United States. So there were a lot of themes that we talked about. Again, isolation. A lot of these women, they felt that they couldn't really talk to their family or talk to people because they didn't know what it's like to be locked up 23 hours a day in prison, for 5, 10, 15 years. So again, the family that they do know what it's like, they have no contact because they're in prison. They can't bond or they can't connect with people because they don't know what it's like to be locked up in prison for all those years. Housing was a huge dilemma, I guess, for the women. I would talk to a woman who was in prison for quite a few years, and she was released, and she didn't have family. She couldn't go to her family because at the time they was on Section 8. And the record that she had, she couldn't live with them. And Section 8 is, it's like a low-income housing. So you're able to get housing for like a very, very low income. It's a program by the government. But she couldn't live there with her family because she has a certain record. And if she would live with them, then the Section 8 housing would be cut off, and the family probably more than likely would have been evicted. So she couldn't go to family. She didn't feel safe in shelters. She had a lot of traumatic experiences. And she had two options: either live on the street or go to her abusive ex-boyfriend who got her into drugs. And she didn't want to live on the street, so she went back to him. It was a bed, it was a roof over her head, it was food. And she told me within a year she was back into selling drugs and crime, and she was back into prison. Thankfully now she's out and she is thriving. Obviously she faces difficulties, but she is in a much better place than she was before. But I just wanted to highlight how important it is to have housing and to have support for a lot of these women. Motherhood, again, was such a huge topic, and it came up a lot in my time with these women. Again, the absence of familial support, the guilt, the stigma that comes with not only just having a record, but being a woman and being a mother and feeling like a failure to your children, to your family, to your community. Because a lot of times these women are sort of pillars in the community, and they have a certain way to uphold. And they felt a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. And I think it was very important to sort of highlight that. And I think we need to pay attention to these themes like motherhood and housing and things like that to better serve women. A lot of things that I've learned, I had sort of a bias coming in because I sort of had some preconceived notions and lived experience myself. So, but coming in there and talking to these women and seeing their struggles, but seeing how they thrive every single day and not just survive was really eye opening to me and really inspiring. In the U.S., again, we don't have great reentry or reintegration programs at all. And again, this is why I'm here now, hopefully to learn from you all and take something back to the United States. I won't take up too much of your time. I do want to just say one more quote here. This really, really hit home for me for a lot of reasons. This is from LT. She was in prison for manslaughter and drugs. And it was really interesting talking to her. Again, I have some lived experience with this, and I went into this and talking to her with a sort of bias, but it was really great talking to her. And this quote here says, "I walked out of prison still carrying the weight of every mistake, every person I disappointed, every chance I threw away, the life that I took. Now, I'm just trying to bring life into everything that I do. I got to help rebuild a community I was trying to destroy." So I'm going to just leave you all with that. Hopefully you can think about that. I got to help rebuild a community I was trying to destroy. That's what we say in restorative justice. Again, she was there for manslaughter and drugs. She's now a pillar in the community trying to help people just get back on their feet and just bring life and joy to a lot of people. So I do want to leave you all with that. Hopefully my this presentation sort of open up your eyes and resonate with you for a little bit. And I'm welcoming questions in the end. So thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shanika, for such a powerful presentation. For sure, a lot for us to think about and discuss further very soon. Now we will hear from Naledi Mpanza. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria at the Center for Human Rights at the Faculty of Law. She is interested in this research in youth participation in health policy and sexual and gender minority rights. She's also a board member at the solidarity organization SAI, the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund in Bergen, the local chapter, and will be telling us about her research, which is focused on the case of Jade September, a trans woman incarcerated in an all-male prison in South Africa. So you have the floor. Thank you, Naledi.
Thank you so much. I'm actually a little bit intimidated to go after such an enthralling presentation, but I really feel honored to be in this space. Good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us for our musings this morning. And just like Sophia said, I am Naledi Mpanza. I'm doing a PhD in something completely different, but this paper comes from my work and civil society engagement as a LGBTQI+ officer at the University of Pretoria's Center for Human Rights. So that role meant that we had a program that was funded by the EU that was meant to make equality courts, which is a civil court in South Africa that promotes equality. And the project sought to make those more accessible to people to report unfair discrimination, harassment, and different types of harm that are not exactly hate crimes, but at that point it was up to hate speech. So what that looked like is training not only civil society members and organizations on how to access these equality courts. What that looked like is having workshops and conferences with presiding officers, so those would be high court judges and magistrates, and also training equality court clerks, so the people who are most likely the first port of contact for someone who's there to report a matter in the courts. So during the process of that engagement as a project officer, we would do a lot of workshops, a lot of trainings at different levels. And one of the cases that were part of our sort of toolkit was this case of September versus Subramoney NO. And it meant that we would be workshopping the case as one of the examples of a case that has gone through the equality courts, but it also meant we were getting different insights. And this paper or this conversation, or part of what I'm trying to establish for this conversation, is based on my interaction with my co-authors of the paper, which are two incredible trans activists in South Africa, Kanyisele Phillips, who used to work for Gender Dynamics, which is one of the key organizations in South Africa. I think it's the first dedicatedly trans rights organization in Africa. She used to work for that organization and worked with Jade September before her case, during her case, and after her case. As well as Grayson Van Gartella, who was part of the legal team and was part of amicus for the case. And I, to be quite honest, they would be the ones presenting here if they were here. But I just so happened to be like the third author and thought that would be an interesting addition to the conversation that we're trying to have today. And the reason why this case was very interesting is because as we were doing workshops, first of all, it made me realize that I don't know anything about South Africa's carceral system. I still don't think I know the full depth. I'm always sharing that I don't even think I know what my thoughts are on abolitionism and whatnot. But so I just want to clarify that this is from that space. I'm coming in from a civil society space, not from a research engagement. But with this paper, what we sought to do was to bring together all our different experiences. Someone who's worked with Jade, someone and is an activist, someone who was part of the court case, people who have worked with the correctional officers who were then compelled to follow the judgment from the case, and myself just reflecting on that space and my politics as a sociologist who is always interested in how people experience things in society. So what we titled this paper, and I'll be reading extensively from it and taking sort of pauses to reflect on some of what we had come together, and I'm trying to pledge allegiance to the work, and some of it might sound like I'm a trans woman myself. I'm a cisgender woman, because a lot of these words came from a collaboration between myself, Kanye, and Grayson. So the title of the paper, we decided to title it Policing Womanhood, and we made it a critical analysis of the September versus Subramoney NO case. I'm going to give a bit of a background on the case. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but what's important is we wanted to, or rather when we engaged with the case, we all agreed that a big part of it was a landmark case that made quite significant strides in acknowledging the rights, the dignity, and affirming the existence and accommodations and the promotion and protection of the rights of transgender women in South African, in the carceral system, but it still had sort of challenges. There were still some issues in there that were still problematic. And as a sociologist, I'm always ready to critique the law because it's like, it's just one system. Trust me, there's other places that govern society. So yes, the law does a great job. I'm sorry, lawyers. It does a great job, but it's not the only governing thing, you know, that sort of drives people. It's definitely not everyone's moral compass. So what we noticed is there's a lot of inconsistencies, and that might be just the nature of a court case. You know, you win some, you lose some. But we found that we still need to critically engage with these because it sort of has to be a continuous conversation, right? Because court cases and court judgments are not fallible. Yes, they're not perfect, right? So a bit about the case. So the case of September versus Subramoney NO and Others is widely recognized as a landmark moment in affirming the unconstitutionality of unfair discrimination against transgender persons on the grounds of gender identity. As a trans woman currently incarcerated, September's case not only highlights the legal recognition of transgender rights, but also serves as a critical reflection of the treatment of trans persons within South Africa's carceral system, as I've already mentioned. So while the judgment is progressive in its affirmation of the inherent human rights of transgender persons by prohibiting unfair discrimination based on both gender identity and gender expression, it simultaneously contains troubling language and rhetoric. And some of this discourse, and this is where we started critiquing, is it echoes anti-gender and anti-trans sentiments which are used more broadly to delegitimize the identities of transgender persons in general and trans women in particular. This sort of duality renders the case especially worthy of critical reflection as it illuminates the fundamental systemic violence that transgender women face, perpetuated by social systems, institutions, and state structures. I'm going to pause there to just share that what we were trying to say here is the way that we understood how Jade was treated, because as I will go into detail now, she was incarcerated in a male prison. She was assigned male at birth, incarcerated in a male prison. it meant that she immediately attracted a lot of violence because her expression was very feminine and she was doing all she could according to all the tools she had to live out her identity, right? So she sought to grow out her hair, to wear feminine underwear, to wear makeup, to wear nail polish, to basically embody all the different tools to help her affirm her identity. And what happened is, interestingly, in the one prison, the first facility that she was incarcerated in, they gave her certain liberties. She was also allowed to participate in talent shows, and she was able to live out, they would at times refer to her with her preferred pronouns, which was she, her. And the issue really started when she was transferred to a different facility. And in that facility, immediately when she was being taken in, was essentially stripped of all of that, right? The violence is listed in the case itself, but it was definitely not allowing her to use any cosmetics that aligned with her identity, or grow her hair, or use her pronouns. It was a harrowing experience, and it got to the point where she was pushed to the point of suicide. So that is one of the huge things that that was mentioned in the case, that this led to, and it was as a result of the harms that she was facing while she was incarcerated. Then she was moved back into this facility, but because of that, there's an understanding. It's not really clear in the case that there was communication between these two facilities, and all of a sudden this facility as well no longer allowed her to live as she did previously. So it was all these very interesting sort of progressions, but it showed us something. There was something definitely happening there, and it's definitely not definitely, but it's not captured very well in the case. But this is where now Kanyisile and Grayson come in, because they engaged with Jade after the case. Right? They engaged with Jade during the case. They understood what was not written in the court judgment, and they were able to give us insights into the fact that definitely this prison chastised this prison, because they were like, oh no, we need to revert to what the system allows, which is, unfortunately, that they insisted that because Jade was assigned male at birth, has not medically transitioned, is therefore a male, and that's how we should treat her, and that's all we're going to do in your male prison. And when they were being sort of protecting themselves, the correctional services system personnel, they would say, oh yeah, it's also for her safety, right? Which was also problematic because it's obviously an excuse. It worked in one point to a certain extent. It's only when there was this sort of challenge, right, that she was then all of a sudden sort of exposed, made more vulnerable, and she started being more exposed to this harm that allowed and justified her being violated and left in a state of indignity. So the reason why we were saying that this was beyond, the reason why we had this paper was to share how it's not just someone who is going through what we could perceive in myself, the naive people who don't know anything about prisons. Oh no, but that's what happens in prison. Everybody gets some kind of violence inflicted upon them. This was a specifically trans attack on a trans person, but also that is legitimized by a system because they had to yield to this prison even though they had been operating in a different way. So what we sought to do is, with this paper, back to the paper, unpack how the September case reveals not only the harsh realities of treatment of trans women in conflict with the law, but also how the discrimination that September faced within the prison system reflects broader societal efforts to police womanhood. The unfair treatment she experienced is not an isolated incident, definitely, but rather an extension of gendered norms enforced throughout society. The reason why we also said that is, and I'll later get into this as well, there's an obsession with the binary, right? There's an obsession with the gender binary that made it such that, and of course we may know, a lot of us, that when it comes to the binary, there's these sort of definitions of who is a woman, who is a man, and how what behaviors should come with being assigned those identities. And we are aware as well that that comes with masculinity and femininity being apportioned to so femininity with women and masculinity with men, and certain behaviors that compromise that or challenge that are definitely punished, are definitely attacked, are definitely othered, and are sought to be policed and controlled. So what we realized is, with her attack, the way she was being attacked was a way of reinforcing this gendered system. And later on in the court case, we also read about the judge also saying that, well, actually, while they were saying we sympathize with Jade in many ways and she won the case, unfortunately, this case is not about challenging the gender binary. It's an actual quote, and I'll get to it at some point. we're not challenging the binary, we're here to talk about her dignity, which was very interesting because the gender binary is actually the foundation for the very harm that she was facing. I'll give you an example. In South Africa, you can change the Department of Home Affairs is the registration, like the Births and Registrations Office. You are allowed to change your gender marker on your ID, and you're allowed to change your name without having to medically transition, right? Or rather have top or bottom surgery. At most, they do encourage. It's still very much a norm for you to start counseling, which is still problematic as well, to start counseling or to at least be on hormones. So South Africa, of course, one of the countries that have made great strides in this place, but there's still that problematic. It might not be the law per se, but a lot of people we've engaged with will say, listen, they want to see a letter from a counselor, a letter from a psychiatrist, a letter from a psychologist. They want to see that you're on hormones. Okay, cool. Well, not cool, but it is what it is for now. We're challenging it. But, and with that system, they're saying that these are the sort of criteria that you need to fit before you're able to basically change yourself in the system. But the problem is the system itself and its binary is still saying we need to apportion particular roles, particular criteria before someone can identify according to this binary. And the reason why I'm mentioning that, and it's been challenged countless times because it's definitely problematic, not everyone can afford, we do not have universal healthcare. So you can imagine it's definitely only the elite that are able to go through that process. I think the statistic for going through this in the public healthcare system is something like it takes 70 years to get all the necessary documentation to allow you to transition. So a lot of people end up having to do it through private healthcare if they can afford it. And we only know of one person, or the only person that, from the reading and having met them, there's a person called Landa Mabenge, who's the first person to take their medical aid to court and compel them to pay for that, for the surgeries. And they did medically transition with bottom surgery, top surgery, and hormones. So what I'm trying to say is the system is still entrenched. So for the court to say, oh no, we're not here to challenge the binary, it's like, but you really could have, you really could have, because that's like the foundation of it all. It's one woman being attacked because she's not fitting into these neat categories of sex and gender and identity and femininity. And we can see that this is just another way of policing this, because we know with the cases of Caster Semenya, which has been sort of taken way too long, that even with intersex persons, the binary is not as productive as we have historically been told it is. It's been rubbished in many ways. There's a case of Maria Pathinho, who was an athlete who was ridiculed because she had lived as a woman for so long, right? And she forgot her femininity certificate one time, had a random cheek swab test, and then was told, oh no, you're not a woman. And yeah, her life was definitely destroyed after that. But and that's from like the 1980s, and Caster is like the 2016s, right? And this case is also 2016, but it's just telling us that there are constant efforts to try and show us that the binary is very problematic. It's not it's not even scientific. That's the worst part. It's constantly being challenged, but we have court cases that are still going at pains to sort of share that, hey, we're not here to challenge that, when we know, as a lot of people that work in this space, that this is not a productive system that works when you're trying to promote the rights, especially of sexual and gender minorities. But yeah, so we went on to then share that, so I wanted to reflect a little bit on the fact that literature also reveals that trans women are disproportionately visible and documented within prison systems, which makes sense because, again, policing, womanhood, so-called deviance sociology, as compared to trans men, which is another specific thing that I wanted to touch on, right? How trans women are policed versus how trans men are policed, story for another day, but I do want to be clear that we are very much aware that there's a difference, which is why this is not a conversation about trans people in general, because there's no such thing. There are particular experiences, just as how Shanika was also sharing that there are particular experiences that are gendered, even when you're talking about a system that everyone is affected by in a particular way. So this disparity marks the starting point of our critique on the policing of womanhood. Scholars have described the compounded harms faced by incarcerated transgender persons as a form of double punishment. The initial punishment of incarceration is layered with this hypervisibility, targeted violence, and systemic exclusion that they endure specifically due to their trans identities. So attending to the unique harms experienced by this population is critical to our understanding of the situation. And what we argued is that the treatment of trans women The treatment of September is symptomatic of broader efforts to reinforce the gender binary, which I've just had a little obsession about now, and it also shows how this harms not only trans women, but also intersex individuals, black women, and others who challenge or exist outside of these normative gender constructs. So recognizing how gender, sex, and race intersects in these attacks necessitates an intersectional approach. We all know that Western patriarchy is a system widely acknowledged as a tool for structural oppression, which emerges as a central force in upholding these norms. So particularly when race is taken into account, I'm not sure if I didn't mention this, but Jade September is a colored woman. So when you were showing us pictures of the West Side, I was like, this is very interesting because it looks like the quintessential description of how Kanye would describe the environment that Jade grew up in. And that definitely comes with a lived experience. It comes with being more exposed to particular harms and norms, I guess. So, so her being a colored woman, a person of color, means that she had particular challenges, which is why we also added this to our conversation. So when race is taken into account, it shows us how the violence endured by these identities originates in the deeply embedded binary model that governs much of social life and enforces gender conformity. One of the theories or concepts that we borrowed from was Judith Butler's normative violence framework, which was very helpful for us because it then, of course, for us, it was like, oh, what a great case. Oh, yes, okay, but something wrong. What is there? And we found that the normative violence framework was very helpful for us to understand norms and violence because our immediate understanding was this is not an isolated incident. How Jade was treated is symptomatic of a system, but how do we bring those together? And the gender binary is one of the ways in which this is normalized. And when we normalize violence, we then legitimize things. And one of the things we legitimize are then not only the harms that people face, or harassment, discrimination, but also the hate crimes. So the murders, unfortunately, the killings, the ridicule, the mirage of different violences that are enacted upon trans women, right? So Judith was very incredible for our understanding and bringing together of our ideas. So normative violence, as some of us might know, refers to the legitimization of harm against those who do not conform to established norms by framing those norms as natural, objective, universal, as opposed to being cultural, constructed, and historically contingent. This idea resonates with related concepts like systemic or structural violence, which are also described as the institutionalization of inequalities that excludes people from meeting basic needs and the violence and detrimental outcomes that emerge from that inequality. I just remembered now that I probably should add, of course, for me, this is not the focus point of the entire conversation, but she was incarcerated for murder, which during our workshops would be interesting because that would add a little bit of spice and be like, do murderers deserve rights? And it's like, okay, we need to have a different conversation now about the dignity, right, of incarcerated persons. But that's something that I did want to add because, and combined with her colored identity and the challenges she faced, Kanye, who worked with Jade and is still in touch with Jade, would say, if she was in this panel, that she was a product of her circumstance in a very big way. And it's not to remove her, that she actually committed the crime, but it's to say that not only has she been a victim of her circumstance, she's now in prison, right, or she's now incarcerated, but she's also continuing to face other challenges of that situation. So she's constantly being violated upon, like her life is part of like a cycle of legitimized violence, of normalized violence, and this incarceration, the experience that she went through, the harm she faced, is basically reiterating that. I'm going to go a bit faster, but I'm going to try and read a little bit more. So I know I haven't touched a lot about her background, but the main parts of the case were that September raised concerns about her being prohibited from expressing her gender identity. So these restrictions included not being allowed to wear her hair long in feminine hairstyles, wear makeup, use female underwear and jewelry, and be referred to using female pronouns. The respondents in the case, there was a whole list of people that were called to account for this kind of behavior, attempted to justify these prohibitions by asserting, in their view, that September is male. The claim was based on her being assigned male at birth, as I've mentioned before, her current anatomical makeup, and what they consider to be her safety risks if she were to express her gender identity while serving her sentence in a male correctional facility. In balancing the perspective of the respondents and September's grievances, the court began its analysis by recognizing the concept of gender identity through reference to international law, particularly non-binding instruments such as the Yogyakarta Principles, drafted by international human rights experts. So the Yogyakarta Principles are a very great reference used by civil society organizations world over. They're relied on and they're constantly being tried to be pushed to be adopted. But I think civil society has just been like, well, we don't care what the international law community does. We're going to use them. They're amazing. We believe in them. They're formulated by experts. It's a political hoax to not use them or legitimize them, but civil society has definitely legitimized how they're used. So this was a great step by the court, right, to say we see, and because they had amicus there to also guide them with the sort of understanding of these instruments that can be used to sort of start us off on the conversation. So as some people might know, the Yogyakarta Principles reiterate that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and all human rights are universal, independent, interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. It further emphasizes that gender identity and sexual orientation are integral to every person's dignity and humanity and must not be the basis for discrimination abuse. I'm going to pause there to bring it back to South Africa. So in South Africa, the particular legislation that speaks to the recognition of the rights of trans persons is specifically, so first it's the Constitution. It's Section 9 of the Constitution, which speaks to equality. The equality, so Section 9 of the Constitution speaks to equality, and it mandated an act which is called the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. And that act mandates courts, which is the equality courts. Now, part of what Section 9 of the Equality Clause of the Constitution says is no one may be unfairly discriminated against, and then there's a list of grounds, more than 12, right? It could be HIV status, country of origin, there's sex, there's gender, and there's sexual orientation. But at some point, they didn't have gender identity, which would speak to the actual experience of trans women, right? So another case by a student, it's Nari Mpela, it's called Mpela versus Manamela. What happened is Nari was a high school student who was harassed by students at the behest of the principal, who was discriminated against. She would be in assembly with other children. The principal would single her out. They would misgender her, call her gay, even though she was openly living out, communicating, socially transitioned, and was a trans girl. It got to the point where boys would harass her in the bathroom at the behest of the principal. So the principal would be like, hey, go into the toilet, go and harass her, pull her clothes down, just violate her in many ways. And it, of course, led to her not being able to finish her matric or her school leaving certificate. So she was able, with the support of civil society organizations, take her principal and the school to court. It was through the equality courts, and she won that case. She won money, and they were meant to pay for her education, I think, for a period of time. So that case was one of the cases where they started to decide on, okay, cool. The Constitution and Section 9 specifically says gender, but gender should be understood broadly to include gender identity. So some people were like, no, but there's no trans people in the Constitution. No, the court has interpreted this. It's been used. So that case also was the background and was definitely mentioned in the decision for Jade. So when we're talking about the Yogyakarta Principles, the South African Constitution has also been interpreting this in light of the same way that the Yogyakarta Principles is understanding gender identity and dignity. I'm going to monster through to the last part, but I did want to just share the legal part of things, because sometimes it feels like it's just discoursing. It's definitely not. It's constitutional. But yeah, I'm not going to go on about the binary model anymore, but I'm just going to now sort of touch on, I do want to read the actual quote from the court case. And the judge was, again, clear that this is not a case challenging the binary model. So they said, I'm just going to read the quote. So this case is not about whether the binary model used in South Africa should be expanded to include a third gender, i.e. transgender. This binary model is therefore unchallenged and still in force. This case is also not about whether the applicant should be allowed to undergo medical treatment in order to transition. The applicant remains a transgender woman who has not transitioned medically and is therefore still legally classified as a man. This is and will remain the position until she completes the process of gender reassignment, which is crazy because we already know that that's sort of a far cry for a lot of people. So we said that this statement reveals how firmly the legal system remains attached to the binary framework, resisting recognition of trans identities unless mediated by medical transition and legal compliance. So in September's experience, the violence of the binary relies in its demand for rigid conformity and its refusal to accommodate the fullness of human diversity. Further, it was the interpretation of the court that extended the interpretation of gender to include gender identity, as with the Narimpele case I mentioned, which would therefore validate the necessity of making reasonable accommodation for September and other trans women in similar situations. And then finally, these are Kanye's words, so I do have to just 1 minute. All right, so in this light, September versus Subramoney can be commended for respecting September's self-identification as a woman, because they took it as that's who our authority is, not anyone else, not anything else, because she's been indignified by the entire harm that she faced. So it can be commended for respecting September's self-identification as a woman. This recognition formed part of the rationale for considering her complaints and the reasonable accommodations they warranted. However, the repeated emphasis in the judgment of her having been assigned male at birth and still being classified as legally male due to her anatomy remains troubling. It reflects a tacit allegiance to essentialist ideals of sex and gender, even when the court appears to affirm transgender identity. This distinction between self-identity and assigned status is frequently weaponized by transphobic actors and institutions as a justification for denying the gender identities of trans women. Even the use of the term transgenderism, which was in the court case, was initially used by the trans community to speak to their existence, but has been distorted into an ism that kind of sounds like racism or fascism, which has led to the trans community sort of distancing themselves from that term. But the courts used it without a footnote to say, there's that sort of problem. So if you didn't know anything about trans activism, you might also end up perpetuating what the court said because it was used in a court judgment, which is deeply problematic, as a lot of us might know. So this essentialist logic, endorsed by transphobic actors, equates womanhood with certain anatomical features, has long been challenged for its exclusionary and dehumanizing effects. So some of us may know of bell hooks who, for instance, resisted this logic of being identified according to anatomical makeup when she refused to wear a prosthetic bra following a single mastectomy. Her choice challenged the dominant ideas that womanhood is defined by the presence of symmetrical breasts and a typical view of how a woman looks like. I think, I can sort of wrap it up there. It's quite a long paper, but I hope that I gave you a taste into our understandings of not only the case, Jade's situation, appreciation for the courts, but a critique of it, because it's great to take many strides. And I think in South Africa, sometimes we get told, oh no, your constitution is the best, you're doing so well. But it's not enough, because these harms continue to take place. We still have murders of trans people, murders of people of the LGBTQI+ community, and they are legitimized. And it's not shocking to people, because to them it's like, do they have rights? And it's like, yes, humanity is the basis of it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and your brilliant reflections also on that paper and on that case. I think that there are a few issues, although you're both talking about different cases, fieldworks that are very different, but there are a few issues that for me quite clearly link those two cases. I think that the issue of the stigma faced by formerly incarcerated women, by incarcerated women, when we have this intersection of marginalized groups, women of color, trans women that are in prison, it's a dimension of marginalization that makes the public discussion in civil society, in academic centers, even progressive, left-wing, very hard, because also of the normative violence which is present in accepting the carceral solution to harm and social problems, right? And the stigma in associating these people then with this idea of criminals who then, are hardly the perfect victims of state violence and state harm. So I'm very happy that we can have this conversation here and advance our reflections on this topic. We do have time for a few questions if our audience has any. And we have the catch box if anyone wants to.
I love catching the box.
Well, if not, then I can start. But I was wondering how this issue of stigma. I wanted to ask Shanika about the Pivot organization. If it's state funded, if it's civil society, where does that funding and organization come from? Because looking at the Brazilian context, which I'm more familiar with in your presentation, you know, the situation of when people leave the prison, there's so little or no support for them from the state. That is something that in Brazil often really gives a lot of space for criminal organizations or people that these people were associated with that in some way put them into prison to provide that kind of support, which of course makes it much harder then for them to change their lives and leave that situation of vulnerability. But at one point there was this one regional reentry support program in the state where I'm originally from that was super interesting and targeted at youth offenders, quote unquote, that gave them educational training and subsidized jobs. And this was a program that it was run by the state and not advertised. It was super successful. The reentry rates went down. The recidivism rates, went down, but it was not advertised at all because there's such social stigma around the issue of incarceration that the government, implementing a successful public policy, thought that they might get a backlash from the population, which might be angry that they're investing public money in criminals who don't deserve rights and don't deserve, which is problematic on so many ways, including in a pragmatic way when we think of how that's going to return to society and impact communities, but also from a basic ethics perspective of human rights and of understanding that people are not disposable. So I wanted to ask in the US and in South Africa if you have any insight on the kind of challenge that poses and also, Lady, from your civil society perspective, strategies to navigate it being quite this being quite an unpopular topic with punitive vision in society.
Pivot is state funded, and most of the workers there are formerly incarcerated. So it's ran and operated by women that are formerly incarcerated. Much like you, it's not really advertised as much. Pivot is more of a boots on the ground type of thing. It's community. It's state funded, but it's community based. So they are out in the streets and trying to get help. They are in prisons as well. Trying to make the transition from prison back into community a little bit more smoother. But yeah, it's definitely a stigma with that. We do have people saying, "Oh, like why are we funding for criminals?" And it's like, guys, like I don't have to live right next to you. If I'm living next to somebody who's been in prison, I want them to have enough resources that they can, so they don't have to resort to other means. So
thank you so much for that. I'm no pressure, but I'm really curious about what it looks like in Norway because of the social program. I'm like, so, but anyways, definitely stigma is a huge thing. I think I mentioned as well earlier on, when we do these workshops, people are like, wait a minute, she murdered somebody? Never mind. Jail. And it's like, oh no. So then we usually have to, instead of having a conversation about trans rights, we have to start talking about like human dignity and what that means, right? But the other thing that I didn't mention is when it comes to stigma, the correctional, so Kanye worked with correctional officers after the case, because one of the judgments was everybody needs to go through gender sensitivity training and workshops. Like anybody who gets hired afresh needs to go through a workshop. And what's weird is the prison wardens would be like, that was a win for Jade. Any other trans whatever needs to take us to court again. And it's like, that's not how court cases work. It's precedence. So there's still this idea that, no, Jade was the strong one. The win was for her, right? So anybody else just fall in line is going to be treated the same, which is crazy, right? Because, and the other thing is funding for these trainings was somehow not provided, or there's always some issues with why, we can't take them away from work to train them. There's not enough time in somebody's onboarding procedure to train them. So the court judgment was great, but how it actually is implemented is not so great. But yeah, definitely, people are just saying, what? It's, which is a whole conversation. Like, we never felt like we were experienced enough, but Nelson Mandela has a quote somewhere saying, the best measure of a society is how they treat their, I think it's like less desirables, or but the idea was how they treat people who have like incarcerated persons or persons who have committed crimes. So we'd give them that quote and then be like, but you need to do a lot more homework. Let's get to the workshop on the equality and at least the unfair discrimination parts.
Yeah.
So
for sure. And of course, even more relevant when we think of how policing is not fairly or neutrally distributed in society, and of course, the more marginalized, they're at a much, much higher risk, not only into being forced into so-called criminal activity or engaging in violence against other people, but in being targeted by the state. So of course, all of these layers come together into a really complex societal issue, but that I think that both of your presentations have been super brilliant in pointing out the nuance and the institutional and legal tools, how they come into that, and that is super interesting for advancing this conversation and inviting us to stay with these unanswered questions and these problems and these difficulties, and move this discussion forward also here at Law Transform in Bergen-Global. So thank you very much to all of you. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
So it's actually too late for questions, I guess.
Yes.
So I think I just want to say, Shanika and Aledi, this was extremely sort of powerful, and I think it left us all a bit we needed to just take a bit of time to reflect, and it was and I think it's definitely something that we want to sort of come back to, and I wanted, in the beginning and also in the text, it's also this is also an invitation to sort of both hear from you, but also think together when it comes to sort of what's most important to try to change. Because you pointed to so many different issues, right? And so many, of course, a lot of this are things that we know, but there are also a lot of things, the harms and indignities and burdens that we don't really know, don't really think about. And also the joys. I think that is something that, or values, that valuable things in life, and how you also can take care of that. So I wanted to just reflect on where is the most important place to start. Where should we sort of think about? And of course, I also wanted you, Shanika, to reflect on this based on what you've seen for now in Norway. But I don't think there is time for that now. Yeah. So maybe it's a cliffhanger until the next session. Yeah.
Yes.
But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Brilliant.